called St Edward's at Oxford, where I got a prize cadetship to Sandhurst in 1936 or so. Then I went to Sandhurst, which at that time was 18 months. That's sort of 37, 38, and in August 38 I was commissioned into the tank regiment.
So you went straight in as a regular officer?
Yeah.
And then, from then until the start of the war, what?
Well, then when you joined the tank regiment, you naturally got to learn all the important technical bits, and that meant from sort of September 38 to December 38, one was learning about gunnery and the motivation side of the tank. And then after Christmas, one went and did tactics and that sort of stuff in a very, very sketchy way. And then I went and joined the 3rd Tank Regiment, which was at Warminster in those days, and given command of a troop of tanks, a troop of medium tanks. I don't really remember what they looked like, but they were bloody great sardine tin, really, nothing else. But they were a sort of 4-man tank with a 2-pounder pop gun, and one was pitchforked into training people in how to operate these things virtually without having any training oneself. Not like one managed to give the young officers in the days when I was commanding. So it was all rather surprising, and it was interesting, of course, and one worked from about 8 in the morning till midday, and then one retired to the mess for pink gin and played games in the afternoon, and that was one's day, really. We were there, I was at Warminster until playing tennis one Sunday. I got a message, which was a code word, which I'd never heard of. So I took around to the adjutant. He said, "Oh, that means we've declared war." I was, in fact, on the tennis court at the time. So that's how it all started. We stayed at Warminster for a bit longer, and then we were shifted off to go into billets, and we went to the Hitchin area.
This is September?
This is September, well no, middle after that, it would have been sort of October, November in 39, and we stayed there until the spring of, no, the early part of 40, when we moved to a place called Fordingbridge, which was on the edge of the New Forest, so we were able to do a bit more training. And during this time we had been equipped with the A13 cruiser tank, which was certainly a great advance on the old medium. But of course training was restricted. You know, people were still a bit charier, one dashing around in the New Forest, churning it all up and disturbing the ponies. And that lasted until whenever it was, May 1940, when we were all hauled. In fact, our tanks had been taken down to Southampton and put on a ship, as it were, for peacetime. In other words, the tanks were all at the bottom, no petrol, all the oil drained off, all the guns in heavy preservation, and the ammunition in boxes, not even in belts, because we were supposed to be going to Cherbourg to train in northern France and then move up to join the expeditionary force. However, Master Hitler had other ideas, and at the time of Sedan and the breakthrough into northern France, because we were more or less ready to go, we were ordered to go to a place called Calais on about the 20th of May 1940, and our tanks were diverted from Southampton to Calais, and we arrived there on whenever it was, say the 20th or so, and for the first 3 days we had to spend taking all the guns out of heavy preservation, unloading the tanks from the bottom of the ship, which meant you had to take all the wheeled vehicles off first, and the soldiers had to sit about in the dunes outside Calais, pushing the rounds into belts and all this sort of thing, and getting everything sorted out. And the consequence of that was that instead of being able to be operational almost straight away, it took us 3 days to get 12 tanks off the ships and operational and ready to go. And we were then ordered to go off to make a breakthrough to rear GHQ, which was somewhere in the Harsbrook area, which, as you may or may not know, is southwest of Calais. And in fact, the whole thing was virtually a shambles, as you can imagine. And down there, we ran into German armoured divisions, and the whole thing was a complete shambles. And we retreated back into Calais, where we made every effort to support the infantry battalions that were there. But it was all very unsatisfactory. The radio sets didn't work properly, and it all ended on the 26th when we'd run out of ammunition and we had no more petrol left, and the order was every man for himself.
So you weren't supplied at all once you got off the ship?
No. And the one interesting thing was that while we were getting everything sorted out, we suddenly realised that the ship had had no electrolyte for the batteries. And it so happened that a naval pinnace came into Calais harbour, commanded by a naval officer whom our adjutant, George Moss, knew. And I well remember him yelling across the harbour, saying, "Bill," whatever his name was, "will you please go to Caffin's in Folkestone and bring back some carboys of electrolyte for our batteries?" I mean, can you imagine? Well, that's just by the way. Anyway, it all ended up on the 26th or 27th or so of May, and every man for himself, and I wandered off with some of my soldiers, making for Dunkirk.
Was this on foot?
Yes.
You left the tank?
Oh yes, yes. No, the tanks were all run out of petrol, and some of them had been destroyed for obvious reasons, and the wheeled vehicles had all been destroyed by us mostly, not the Germans, I may say. And off one went, and one knew that there was some sort of a resistance going on at Dunkirk, so one aimed for that. And very early on the morning of the 27th, I think it was, I wandered across the dunes and stumbled on a German armoured car. And that was the end of it, as far as I was concerned.
So you were actually captured on the beach at?
Yes, between Calais and a place called Gravelines, which was the next place along. And I well remember that morning, if I may just say this, that I was standing there chatting to the young German officer who spoke perfect English, been educated at Oxford, and we stood there in the very early morning sunshine looking at the white cliffs of Dover, and I said, "I suppose that's where you're going next?" And he said, "No, we're going to Russia." Now that astonished me because, and thinking back on it, that was the 26th or 7th of May 1940, and the frontline troops had an idea then that they were off to Russia at some stage, rather than to go to the UK, which was interesting.
Yeah, that's strange, isn't it? Had you considered that you may be captured, or had you had any training about that?
No, none whatever. No. One had thought about being wounded, and one had thought about being killed, and made whatever arrangements one did make as a very young person of 21 or whatever it was. But being captured, certainly not. So it was all a bit of a shock.
I think this is the difficulty I have, and I think a lot of people who, like myself, are interested in companies, is to realise that the ages of the chaps involved at the time. I mean, you were all very young.
Well, yes, but of course there were also, don't forget, the squadron leaders we had at that time were all chaps who'd served in the First World War in one form or another, so they were a lot older, and there seemed to be a hell of a gap somehow between us young ones and all the other sort of more senior officers. I don't know how that was, but that was the way it was.
And what about, was that the same with the actual troops, or were they all younger?
No, they were normal as they are today, really. You know, a mixture of sergeants and corporals, etc.
Could you speak any German at all?
Now, I couldn't speak German at the time, although I had learnt German at school, so the grammar and that sort of thing was okay. It was later on that I managed to pick up the language a bit.
So there we are on the beach. You've been captured. What was the next? What happened?
The next thing was one was herded off away from the frontline soldiers, and we were marched off in great columns, French as well as British, to a field, as far as I remember, somewhere to the southwest of Calais. And there was an awful lot of shouting and Germans getting frightfully excited, which of course to us, I mean, after all, you must remember that we'd been fighting in Calais for about 5 days with very little sleep and not much food, and we were all pretty tired and shattered. I mean, the fact that you'd been captured was completely shattering, really. And then we were herded that first night into a field, and on the way into it, most of us were thrashed across the backside by Germans with rifle butts, which was not a very interesting sort of or nice introduction to them. And then from there onwards we marched for 17 excuse me, for 17 days.
March for 17.
So 17 days, yes.
Presumably towards
Which was,
Germany.
well, we thought we were going towards Germany, but in fact, looking back on it, we went way south of the area of Calais before turning left, as it were, and going eastwards towards Germany, which was understandable. After all, there were certain operations going on around Dunkirk and so on and so forth, and they wanted to keep us well out of the way. And they provided no food. Occasionally we managed to acquire some by walking up the line of march and diving into a shop as we went through a village or something, and most of us had some money, and buying what we could. But they in fact provided no food whatever for the whole of that time until we got into somewhere in the sort of Trier area of Germany, where we were put into barracks and then got some food. But it was all, you know, do what you can and get on with it. It was all part of the German business of making the morale go, for a ball of chalk.
You think that was planned?
Oh, I'm damn certain it was, yes. And in any event, you know, it's not easy to feed a whole lot of people like that.
That's right.
That now and again we were put into a church where the local priest were magnificent, particularly in a place called Ukellier, I remember, where we had really a very good slap-up meal, you know, and we're in shelter.
How many would you estimate were in your party at the time?
Difficult to say, but mixed ranks, French and British, I suppose 400 or 500, that order. Quite a sizable setup, really.
Quite a few of the people I've spoken to have been were surprised at the number of French, because they seem to appear from nowhere.
Well, they did indeed, and what's more, the French, of course, are not very good at marching, and we were trying to march sensibly and sort of make the best of it. And the Germans purposely put the French at the head of the column, as they were shambling along with their suitcases and bundles and things. And it was extraordinary to me that when a Frenchman went through a town he knew or where he had relations, they were waiting with suitcases by the side of the road, which they handed over, and which the Germans allowed the French, of course, to put their suitcases on the truck that was following up at the back. Yeah, it was all part of a way of lowering morale. I can't remember how long it was, but we eventually arrived at a place called Laufen, of which you will have heard, which was the first camp that we were all herded into, where the Germans promptly shaved off all the hair on the basis that, that we were probably lousy, well, we might well have been, but that's a nasty morale shaker too, as you can imagine.
It's the first time I've heard that.
Oh, really? I'm surprised at that.
I didn't realise that.
I found that was a real degrading sort of experience.
And that was an off flag, wasn't it?
That was an off flag. Off flag, I can't remember, 7C?
7C.
Something like that, yeah. That was in the area of Salzburg.
By the Austrian border.
That's right, by the river Mulde?
No, that's the coldest one.
Oh, that's the coldest one. What the hell was it called? Well, Salzach, I think.
So, and you were then in Laufen for?
I was in Laufen for June, I suppose we got there. So I was there for the rest of that year until the early part of 41. And then I was moved to Poland, to Posen, to an underground fort.
Was this the reprisal?
I think it was a reprisal of some sort, and I can't imagine why, we couldn't imagine, some of us, why on earth we were chosen to go, because after all, we were pretty insignificant second lieutenants. But nevertheless, I suppose about 140, 150 of us were shifted off there.
Because there was this, they were doing a reprisal for apparently some German prisoners in Canada had been allegedly mistreated, been handcuffed and so on.
Yeah, but that tough business was later.
Oh, was it?
Yeah. The handcuff business occurred when we were at Eichstätt.
Oh, did it?
Yeah. When all the Canadians who had been captured at Dieppe, who happened to be there, were then put into handcuffs. And that was about 42 or 43, back into 42.
It also went on in a camp in Poland. I can't remember.
Did it? I can't think why we were sent there. I'm sure it was because some German prisoners were allegedly mistreated or something somewhere.
And you said Thorn?
No, Posen.
Posen.
No, Thorn was another one.
That's right.
There were two of them. But this was Posen.
And you were there?
I was there for 3 months, I think, or so. Very uncomfortable, very nasty, full of fleas. One pump of cold water was all the water there was for washing and everything else.
What type of camp was that?
It was an underground fort.
So Napoleonic or something?
I imagine, yeah. It had a great sort of dry moat around it, and you were underground. Occasionally we were allowed out, I can't remember. But it was all very uncomfortable and full of fleas, from which some people suffered terribly. A lot of people are allergic to flea bites, and those that were swelled up in an awful way, poor things.
And you went from there to?
There to Warburg. Does that make sense? I think that was right. And it's a long time ago now, Dave. And one does, one only remembers the sort of salient points. But to Warburg, where we were until we moved to a place called Biberach, which was way down south. And from Biberach to Eichstätt. I think we were in Warburg for about a year, Biberach for about 6 months, and then to Eichstätt, where I took part in the Eichstätt tunnel, which is why I ended up at Colditz.
Could you tell us something about that Eichstätt tunnel business?
Yeah, it was dug from, there were 6 blocks in Eichstätt, quite close to the wire. And block 2 was the closest, as far as I remember, And it was in fact the one in which the Canadians had been handcuffed. And the plan was to build a trapdoor in the loo, because it was tiled, and tunnel from there to the under the wire, which was on the edge of a hill, under a road, with a hut the other side, one hoped one might get into, to open the tunnel from. And this virtually was what happened, except that on the way there were quite a lot of snags, in that there were rocks we met and so on, and the nearer we got to the wire and the hill, the nearer the surface we had to come, because the rock was getting a bit close to the surface. And in fact, when the tunnel was broken in June of '43, we were very close to the surface indeed, which in many ways was an advantage, but of course it made it probably easier for the Germans to discover, which they never did, in spite of the fact that some nice British gentleman threw a tin over the wires telling the Germans there was a tunnel in Block 2. Yeah. We were planning to get it out in the spring of '43, but because of that incident it was put off, and in fact we broke out of it on the King's birthday in June, or official birthday in June '43.
They actually put a note in a tin? Or?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Was it ever discovered who it was?
No. You know, people at this stage had got into a rut, and they were taking exams, and they were studying this and studying that, and they just didn't like their peace disturbed. And of course, if we got to tunnel up, it meant a bit of an upheaval for all the other inmates.
I've read this quite often, that particularly senior officers at some camps didn't like the idea of escape at all, because of exactly what you've just said. It disturbed the...
That's true, and of course that's understandable, I suppose. But you know, when you're young and you don't like not being able to walk out of the front door. And anyway, you know, one felt that up to the time I got to Colditz, I felt that I might still be a useful member of the fighting forces, but then after that it was pretty obvious that the people who should have been got home were RAF people, and people who'd had expensive training and so on. I mean, an out-of-date second lieutenant in the tank regiment is not much value to anybody.
So, what happened on the actual breakout? How many of you got out?
At the time, it was a record, something over 60. And it was too many, of course, really, because that meant that there were so many people wandering about that it was worthwhile the Germans calling out the Home Guard and the Boy Scouts and everything else you could think of. So nobody, in fact, got away, because wherever they went, I was out for about 3 days, travelling by night. And eventually I'd run myself out of water, and I dived into a village, to the village pump, and somebody had thought of that before, and there was a farmer waiting there with a sawn-off shotgun.
Did you go off alone?
Yes, I did. Actually, that's a mistake too.
Was it?
Yeah, I thought it wasn't. But the fact that you hadn't got anybody to talk to, you hadn't got anybody to discuss the plans of what you were going to do and where you were going to go, although you discussed it before you got out, once you're out it becomes very lonely. And of course, you know, you've got nobody to watch out for approaching farmers or children or whatever. And it was a mistake. I had planned to go with somebody else, but at the last moment it was all changed, so I decided to go by myself.
So, do you know where it was you were recaptured? Or?
No, I'm afraid I haven't the foggiest idea. All I know was that it was a very nice farmer, and he took me back to his farm, where I met his wife and his two young children, I think it was, to whom I was able to give all my chocolate, because they hadn't seen it for a long time. No, he was delightful chap, actually. Just a plain, simple, nice peasant farmer chap.
And then you were taken back to Eichstätt?
Yes, taken back, not to Eichstätt camp, but to a castle that one had seen in the distance on the top of a hill, where we were kept while they made whatever arrangements it was, from which 2 or 3 people managed to escape, actually, but they didn't get very far. And eventually we were moved from there to Colditz.
So you went into Colditz?
Yeah.
As a group?
Yeah.
So that was quite a big...
that was 50 or 60 people.
And how many were there when you got there?
At Colditz?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, it was an international type camp at that stage. There were French, Belgians, Dutch, a few British.
When was this? 41?
43.
43?
Yeah.
So it was still in...
Some people, British, had been there, of course, since the party with Kenneth Lockwood, Dick Howe, and Peter Allen, that lot, had got out of Laufen in 41, and they were sent straight to Colditz, and they'd been there since then.
Was Pat Reed still there when you got there?
No, he'd gone. No, he got away before I got there.
So
I think we got there sort of late summer of 43, and I have a feeling that Pat got out of Colditz in the spring.
Of 43?
43. Mm.
What were your first impressions of the camp when you, presumably...
Forbidding. Looked impregnable. It's awfully difficult to remember, Dave, actually, but I suppose one thought, well, this is it, you know, we never get out of here, and what's the point?
But you were fairly soon told that people had got out of there, right?
Well, yes, I mean, you know, we're talking to, one knew a lot of people there, of course, because people who'd escaped from other camps that one had been in all seemed to end up there. And so consequently, all the chaps in Colditz were all people who'd escaped or made a nuisance of themselves in some way or another, and so therefore, you know, morale was good, and they were good fellows. And everybody had the same sort of object, either helping or getting away.
So what sort of reception did you get from the prisoners themselves?
Well, I mean, they were surprised to see so many of us, I think. It was nice to see a lot of old friends again. And very soon, you know, we'd settled in and joined in all the jollifications that were going on, like helping people to escape and all that stuff, and finding out what the form was.
Got absorbed into the...
Yeah, and in fact, we were put into a block on the, south side of the castle, where we were all together, and I think it was on the second floor, and on the first floor the Poles lived, and you know, one got to know some of them, and I soon found myself helping them to dig a tunnel.
Did you really?
Yes. I mean, in no time flat. Very unpleasant tunnel it was, because we got through the wall and into a drain, thinking, you know, that would lead us somewhere. And the first thing you met was an electric cable that you had to either crawl over or under. And then you went past the outflow from the kitchen, so every now and again a great lot of dirty water and potato peel and God knows what else slooshed over the top of you.
Somewhere the other day, the number of tunnels that were actually started in Colditz.
Extraordinary, isn't it, actually?
30s or something.
Extraordinary. Actually, everywhere you went, there were people beavering away. But it was all good stuff, you know. I mean, it occupied your mind, and you felt that you were doing something.
Kept you off the streets.
Kept you off the streets. That's right.
So you were involved with the Polish
Yeah.
tunnel. What about other activities there? Were you involved with anything else there?
I was involved in the glider, both in the carpentry side and on the stooging side. And I did a lot of work in the theatre, building scenery and stage managing and a bit of acting here and there. And I also did a trick, I think it was twice a week, cooking. And the arrangements were that there was a stove on each floor, and chaps who ran small messes and produced something to be cooked, and we cooked it for them, which was quite an interesting occupation.
About the theatre,
Yeah.
I've had very little from any of the other interviews.
Oh. No, I suppose you wouldn't have really, because
but apparently it was quite active, wasn't it?
Let's think now. The aim of the thing was to try and produce a show a fortnight, and there was a man called Teddy Barton, whom none of us have seen since leaving Colditz to this day, who was in the theatre, and he was a very, very good director. And in some way he was able to get the necessary scripts from some organisation, and I should think for most of '44 we managed to produce very nearly one show a fortnight, which was quite a task when you think we had to build the scenery out of nothing and make costumes or whatever was necessary. Actually, we did mostly the Noel Coward plays, which didn't need too much in the way of costumes, and one or two musicals, because quite a lot of people, including Jimmy, of course, were musical people. And the ingenuity necessary, as you can imagine, to make props and build the scenery was quite something. We had a series of flats to work with, and we pasted newspaper onto that, made from millet paste. The millet was supplied for us to eat, I may say. It was so disgusting it wasn't true, but it made very good paste. And newspaper, when you stick it onto a canvas flat, hardens the thing up. And then you could paint it and do all sorts of things. And by and large, in the book Dator, there is a picture of the set for Gaslight, which in fact I built with some chums. And if you've got a copy of Dator, I expect you have a look at that, because it shows what can be achieved with almost nothing. And the tools were supplied by the Germans on parole, as it were. You know, they weren't used for escaping, and they wouldn't use them for escaping. They went up to it.
It was pretty well attended, was it?
Oh, absolutely, yes. A show went, there was a dress rehearsal, and I think 2 nights saw everybody who wanted to see what was there.
Did the Germans go?
Oh yes, rather. They were very keen about going.
Really?
Yeah.
What about the other nationalities? Did they have their own theatrical?
Now that's a very good question. They could have done before I got there. Don't forget, I'm only talking about from June '43 onwards. And shortly after we got there, they moved the other nationalities out, and it became an all-British setup, with 1 or 2 minor exceptions, from the autumn of '43 until early '45.
A lot of the ex-prisoners say that after the foreigners went, it was a different camp, but you probably wouldn't have been too aware of that, having not been there.
No, we weren't there too long with the national, but I can understand that entirely. I mean, the whole thing became a sort of British organised setup. I mean, before that, with the international people there, you couldn't organise anything, as you can imagine, particularly with the French. But it was too difficult altogether, and it just sort of bogged along gently. I mean, each nationality had its own senior officer who was nominally in charge, but of course, you know, they never liaised with each other or anything. So I suspect that that was one of the reasons why the Germans moved them out, because it all became too difficult.
Really? That's
I would
interesting.
think.
Yeah. I've never heard.
I don't know. That's only a theory of mine. But if you can imagine having a camp full of people, most of whom had escaped or made a nuisance of themselves in some way or another, of 5 or 6 different nationalities, trying to get things to function as a whole would have been very difficult. And I suspect that's why they were all moved. And I suppose we should be honoured that we were left there.
If that's the right word.
If that's the right word, yeah.
So, presumably, the theatre activities went along in parallel with escape activities.
Oh, with everything. I mean, I started work at 7 o'clock in the morning. I was looking after 5 people in my own mess, doing the cooking and the preparing and looking after them. Then I would dash off to the theatre for whatever, and then there would be lunch to be prepared or whatever. And then possibly after that I would do some other activity, like looking after the stooging for the glider or making something or doing something. Then come the evening there would be the cooking bit to be done. And one literally fell into bed, you know, at 9, 10 o'clock at night, exhausted, which was fine.
And those activities, most of them you took on by choice.
Yeah.
Because some people apparently were quite happy to take things easy.
Well, yes, of course, there were some people who never got out of bed, or, you know, and there was a bit of booze about, and they would drink that and read or play cards or do something or gamble. Quite a lot of gambling went on. But not for me. I mean, I wanted to try and be active. Oh, and there might have been some game of stool ball or something to be played in the afternoon. You know, there was always plenty to do if you put your mind to it. And if anybody wanted any help with whatever it was, you know, I mean, I did a bit of the forging of letters and that sort of thing.
What, the codes?
Well, no, the writing of letters.
Oh, I see.
You know, and making them look as though they've been typed. You can learn to do this.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, a letter giving somebody authority to go from, say, Colditz to Hanover or wherever, looking for work or going to some factory or other. We produced all those sort of letters.
Because apparently there was a very clever forger.
Oh, there were plenty of them. I mean, it's amazing how many people, the talent that there was. I mean, when we were at Laufen to start with, one of the padres was a vice-chancellor from Peterhouse College in Cambridge, and he realized quite soon that it was necessary to do something to occupy everybody. And so he organized a place like a university. And he found out what talent there was there, and you could learn almost anything. Out of 5,000 odd people, you know, there's a good deal of talent. And so that was how we were occupied to start with. You know,
A great deal of that went on in Colditz as well, did lectures and...
Oh yes, well, there were always that sort of thing going on, but less in Colditz really than anywhere else, because A, there weren't very many people, and B, everybody was interested in getting out of the damn place or helping others to do so.
How did you overcome the problem when you were doing these, you know, forging these letters and things? How did you overcome the problem of Germans just walking in on you? Presumably that was all...
Oh, well, you just had somebody looking out, and you know, there were hides all over the place. You can imagine an old castle with very thick walls. It was easy enough to make hides, or under the floorboards or whatever, loose boards and that sort of thing, or on the back of lockers, and you know, hundreds of places.
I would imagine that something like that you would need quite a peaceful atmosphere to do something.
Indeed.
You couldn't do that in the middle of the courtyard.
No. There were you know, rooms during the day were fairly quiet and peaceful, and you could just go on. All you need was somebody to give you a shout if one of the ferrets or German guards came into the camp. So
you actually trained, you were saying, to make the letters look like typewritten.
Well, yes, there were people who had this skill who could train you, and I did a bit of it. There was a fellow called Trevor Beat, who was a submariner who had tried to scuttle his submarine in the Norwegian campaign, and he'd tried to do it over the top of a sandbank. It wasn't very successful, which the poor chap got court-martialed afterwards. But you know, he was exonerated. But he was a very neat writer, and he took up this business and was extremely good at it. And it was he, actually, who asked me if I would have a go. But I soon got tired of it, actually. If anybody said, you know, can you do this or do that, or help with this and help with that, of course one was delighted to do so. And it all helped to break up the terrible pattern one got into if one wasn't careful, and the monotony of it all. I mean, the one thing that films like the Colditz story or the television program cannot reproduce is the boredom. I mean, it's not interesting, boredom. And as you can imagine, over the years, one had been intensely bored at times, although you know, one tried not to be. And the other thing, of course, you couldn't reproduce is how much thinner everybody was who was there. I mean, I now weigh, what, 13 and a half, and when I came out I weighed 9 and a half. And it alters one's entire appearance.
I remember John Davis telling me exactly the same.
Yeah, I'm sure.
He's a very
because he's a big fella.
And he weighed 9 stone or 9.5 stone.
Yeah, yeah. And one didn't notice it, you know, because everybody else was the same. And of course, the feeling of gauntness is the thing you can't ever reproduce in a film or a video.
Were you aware of the difference then, thinking along those lines, were you aware of the difference between you and the Germans that came into the camp, whether they be Wehrmacht or civilians? Were they in a better state?
Well, I suppose they were, in a way, yes. After all, we, as you well know, we had quite a good black market going. And so out in the country, produce was available, and the Germans had it. I suspect that the ordinary country folk in the little town like Colditz was quite reasonably fed because of their ability to get farm produce. And as far as I remember, the soldiers all looked quite reasonably fit, even though some of them would come back from the Russian front. And the civilians that came in looked perfectly reasonable, it seemed to us.
Now, you said there were 5 in your mess.
Yeah.
Do you remember who they were?
Yes. You want me to tell you?
Please.
There was somebody called Tony Rolt, of whom you will have heard. Hector Christie was a Gordon Highlander. Tony Bamfield, who was Rifle Brigade, captured me in Colditz in Calais, and Lance Pope, and myself. Is that 5? Yes.
And you stayed together?
No, we were part of a larger mess when we first got to Colditz, of course, and then you suddenly discovered that the people you thought you liked, you didn't like so much, and eventually, you broke up into smaller outfits where you could all get on with each other. And I can't remember why. I mean, to start with, when we moved, when all the foreigners had gone, I was in a mess with Mike Harvey and Jack Best, whom you know well, and others, and there were about 8 or 10 of us there. And then for some reason that broke up, I hadn't the slightest idea why, and I found myself looking after the 5 people that I talked about, all of whom were strong characters, and not easy people to get on with, but for some reason it worked. And as I was the only one who was prepared to look after the catering side of it, such as it was, I just took it on and did it.
Again, as we were saying earlier, because it gave you something to do as
well.
As anything else.
It was, yes. I mean, food was important. It assumed monstrous importance, really, and because I'd had a little bit of experience of cooking, and I'd watched what my mother did and that sort of thing, had a few ideas about it, and I was prepared to do it. I took it on.
You were saying earlier about the boredom, which interested me, because quite often that's one of my questions. How did the boredom? And I've always been surprised that some people don't seem to be aware, or they've forgotten of the boredom. I remember somebody, I can't remember offhand who it was, said if anybody was bored, it was their own fault. But then I think what you've said bears that out to some extent.
Well, yes, it does. It does. I mean, people who were not what one might call self-sufficient did find it very difficult, I think, particularly in the days when there weren't many books, and there weren't many packs of cards, and there weren't many games and that sort of thing to keep people amused. What do you do?
Quite so.
Okay, you can talk up to a point, but then if you're not interested in people, you're pushed then, aren't you?
But even bearing in mind the fact that the population was very static,
Yeah,
and you were there a long time,
yeah.
you can't be surprised really that relationships were stressful at times.
Oh, very much so, very much so.
This is the part I think that fascinates me, that the fact that in fact you did all get on very well together for the majority of
It was remarkable, actually. I mean, I think, you in those sort of circumstances, you gravitate towards people like yourself. Although you couldn't choose whom you lived with, they were thrust upon you, as it were. But if you were in a room of, say, 20 to 30 people, 3, 4, 5 or 6 are going to get on with you and you with them. And that's what happened. You then divided yourselves into the bits that did get on. And anybody who was, thinking about it, and I'm fascinated by this because people are very important, I don't remember there being too many people that one didn't get on with. There were, of course, 1 or 2 idiots, and there were 1 or 2 people who quite often stole things from a locker and that sort of thing, people who should have known better. But in a funny sort of way, you rode with that and gave them the benefit of the doubt and so on, and said, oh, poor sod, poor chap. I don't remember, really, anybody who was a complete idiot. And that's surprising, isn't it, out of that number of people?
I think it was,
I'm sure there must have been some, but there certainly weren't any at Colditz.
I think it was Jimmy Yule said to me, echoing what you've just said, that he couldn't remember any really serious arguments.
No, I don't think there were. We had a few in the theatre, but not serious. I mean, trying to get something done or work out some form of how to perform and so on and so forth, but nothing desperate. And of course, I suppose something to do with the fact that if you had these terrible arguments, there was nowhere for you to go to get away from it all. I mean, you couldn't go for a walk and that sort of thing, as one would do in this life that we lead now.
What would you say, we were talking about boredom, there must have been a lot of stress and depression as well in that.
Very much, yes.
How did that affect people?
Well, I suppose, are we talking about Colditz or before that? Colditz was a different sort of era in a funny sort of way. All the camps that one been into before that had a certain amount of room, So you could go out and walk. For instance, Varberg was a vast place, and there was plenty. There were rugby pitches and soccer pitches and that sort of thing, and there was a bit of that went on. So you could get rid of your depressions or whatever it was then. And of course, one didn't allow oneself to think about it too much. I mean, the fact that a letter arrived from home made one think about it a bit, but you just had to put it at the back of your mind. I think very much like, I suppose, somebody who's put into prison has to do that sort of thing. I mean, I think it's very much the same.
I think one of the things that interested me when I first became interested seriously in cults, I mean, I've been interested since I saw the film in the 50s, but seriously interested, was somebody saying that solitary confinement was quite a good thing.
Not bad at all.
You away from
your
other, from the other prisoners, just for a while.
That's perfectly true. I did 2 lots, as far as I remember, about 10 days each, and it was very welcome to start with, and it was also quite interesting in that you were put on fairly severe rations. You weren't allowed to take any of your own private food into solitary confinement. And the ingenious ways that people thought up of getting bits and pieces to, for instance, I remember in Colditz, the cells were very near the main gate. And one day I was sort of reading on something, thinking of nothing probably, and there was a rattling at the window, and there on the end of a piece of string was a bar of chocolate, which somebody had lowered down from up above. You know, that sort of simple thing like that made one's day, as you can imagine.
Because there was the story, I'm not sure who it was, but somebody managed to open the cells of a night and
oh, I'm sure, yes. I mean, I suspect that was somebody like Bush Parker, the Australian, who was very good at picking locks. He made it a thing, and I expect, because he was often in there, and I expect he was the one who did that. I couldn't do it. I tried very hard. And
what about other characters?
Well, firstly, Checo. And I needn't elaborate on him, you know all about him. Douglas Bader, for all the wrong reasons. I mean, a real shit.
So I believe.
Yeah. I was at the same school as Douglas, and I knew him before we were captured. I wasn't there at the same time, but he used to come down and play against us. Willie Todd, the SBO, Lance Pope, who was the interpreter, who was in my mess, as I told you, and was an extraordinary character. He was married to a German. Know the story about him?
Remind me.
I don't know if I've told this story. I was sitting in my office in Bad Oeynhausen in about September 45, and Lance Pope walked in, and I'd last seen where it was 4 months before. Now, he was married to a German lady, and every time he escaped, the Germans went straight to where she was living and waited for him to appear, which of course he never did. Anyway, he walked into my office in September 45 in a hell of a state. So I gave him a drink, said, now pull yourself together, what's the form? He said, they have forcibly divorced my wife from me, and she's now married to a stinking German with 2 small children. What am I going to do? I said, forget her. What else can you do? And he stayed with us for, I can't remember how long it was. Now, don't forget, this chap was a fluent German speaker, really fluent, who'd worked in Germany before the war. And anyway, we calmed him down and off he went. And I heard later that he'd remarried somebody else and had worked from about the late 40s until he retired in the British Embassy in Bonn. Well, the place was stiff with personalities. I mean, you've met some of the characters who are at Colditz now, and they've all got great personality, haven't they?
Absolutely.
And so it's invidious, really, to single out people. And the thing that I find so refreshing is that you may not have seen somebody for donkey's years, and then you go to a function like you chaps have, and there you meet 4 or 5, and you're way back, you know, on net again, chatting away.
It's
No problem.
I'm smiling because everybody says exactly the same.
Yes.
It's as though that the intervening time.
Well, I suppose that if you go through, after all, 5 years of fairly unpleasant, I mean, it wasn't all unpleasant, of course it wasn't, but you do get a certain rapport, don't you?
Friendships made then stayed made.
They do stay, yeah.
And the thing is, or you've mentioned 1 or 2 people who were pains in the butt, if we can,
Yeah,
we can call
yeah,
it a phrase.
yeah.
But the majority of people are still remembered very well.
That is true, and I think people who were pains in the butt were bloody soon told they were a pain in the butt. I mean, you know, you didn't stand on any ceremony or anything, there wasn't any need to. Except that you were fairly well confined, and if somebody put a foot wrong, they were bloody soon put in the right, and so they should have been,
Quite so, especially in confined.
under those circumstances.
I mean, 1 or 2
Because
people.
the other thing you've got to remember is this, that the majority of us had been to public schools, to boarding schools, which was much the same. I mean, my remembrance of my 4 years at Teddy's was that the holidays were fine. The moment you got back to school, you were a bloody prisoner. Because you simply couldn't walk out of the gate. If you did, you got your ass kicked, or bashed, as the case may be. And
You've been back to Colditz?
no, I haven't actually. No, I've been asked many times, but I honestly haven't wanted to go.
Have you read any of the books?
Yes, I read most of them, I think.
Are there any you like particularly?
I think so. None of them really stand out. I suppose Pat grasped the market, and that was it, wasn't it, really? And everybody sort of followed suit. I'm not impressed with any of them, actually. And the thing that I've always thought is that the really interesting book would have been, A, about personal reactions, and B, the ingenuity and humour of the Brit under those circumstances. There's a lot of interesting things about how you made tools for digging tunnels and how you adapted things for certain purposes that weren't designed for that, which is a thing I love doing now anyway.
Jim
And I-
just told me a little bit about it, because he actually made keys and things.
That's right, yes. And you know, making tools for digging and making the conduits for breathing and all that sort of stuff, and how you adapted foods that weren't meant to be eaten in a certain way to eat them in another way. For instance, water biscuits I used to grind up with a bottle full of water and make into flour, and then make pies and things of them. And you can do the same with dried peas, if you ever thought about it, which I don't suppose you have, and why should you? But you can make quite a nice sort of green flour out of dried peas, which I used to do, and fill it up with eggs and bacon. Quite nice, actually. A horrid thought now, but...
The
Any
films
thoughts
and
about
the
the
TV
films?
then, did you
Oh, I enjoyed them. Yes, of course. I saw them all. I enjoyed them. But as I said, you know, A, the people were all too well dressed. B, they were all too fat. And you can't really portray the boredom. But the incidents that were done were good, you know, and it did give an impression, didn't it?
I think so. But as you say, it gave an impression that things were going on all the time, which obviously
Well, they weren't, no.
there must have been long spells when it was very, very...
Well, it was only enlivened really by the news, which the old horse would read to us, and the odd incident where somebody came into the courtyard and caused some sort of diversion, and the burning of the palliasses and the fire engine and all that stuff. I mean, those were great highlights, really.
I think the funniest one I've ever been told is the ladder incident.
Yes.
I like to try to picture the guy's face when he came back and saw a 4-foot ladder.
Yes. Yeah.
But that sort of thing must have been wonderful, really.
Well, that was great, and the story I told about R.T.R. Ewing and the dog.
Can you repeat that for us?
Yeah. This took place in Varberg, where it was a vast camp, it was enormous on people, and it had 2 gates. And one day a dog got in, and R.T.R. Ewing, who was a fluent German speaker, got hold of it, dressed himself up, put a string round its neck, walked up to the second gate away from the guardhouse and said to the chap, "I've just been fetching my dog." And the chap let him out. And off he went. He didn't get very far because the guard commander came round and the fellow said, "Oh, just let Farmer Giles out."
It must have been worth doing.
Of course, I mean, just for the diversion, And did anybody ever tell you that people it shows the sort of depth to which one sinks, that there were people in Varberg, which, as I said, is a vast place. I suppose round the perimeter it was 1 mile to 1.5 miles inside the wire. And there were people who spent their day pushing a ping pong ball round the outer perimeter with their noses, setting up a record time in which to do it. I mean, how crazy can you get? And think of the state of your nose by the time.
And let on your knees.
Oh, God. Extraordinary, isn't it? Really.
You doing the war, Daddy?
Yeah, exactly. I pushed a ping pong ball around a prisoner walkout with my nose.
Incredible.
Mm.
Are there any other incidents that you remember that particularly stick in your mind about Colditz or any of the other camps for that matter?
No, the ones that always stick in my mind are the fire engine incident at Colditz and the burning of the palliasses.
Can you tell us about the fire engine?
Well, that was in the film, wasn't it?
Mm.
Right? And in fact, that was where the fire engine arrived because the palliasses were burning, and it was a fire engine drawn by about 4 chaps who drew it up, promptly put their coats alongside the fire engine, and discovered to their horror when they got back that all their papers, their ausweises and anything else had disappeared, and they were all being copied and photographed as far as possible heavily by all the chaps who were working. And the commandant eventually had to go to the senior British officer and say, "Look, these chaps have got to have these papers back." Of course they were produced, but not until copies of them had been taken and format and so on made, so we were up to date in that.
Remember any of the atmosphere in the camp? Perhaps when you heard about the murder of the 50 guys that got out of Sargon.
Oh, well, you can imagine what the reaction to that was. Absolute. Well, I wasn't surprised, you know. It had to happen sometime. And then there was the business of Dusty Miller, who disappeared completely off the face of the earth. So, you know, one always thought that would happen or could happen, and one was surprised it didn't happen more often, to be honest.
So you'd had the commandos there as well, hadn't you?
Indeed, yeah.
Did you know what had happened to them, or not until afterwards?
Not till afterwards, actually, no. But
Anyway,
it's always a possibility, isn't it, that when you're up against that sort of thing, as it will happen, some idiot will behave badly and so on and so forth. And after all, don't forget in Colditz we had people who'd been in the hands of the Gestapo, people like Kit Silverwood Cope. Has he been about?
I don't know.
Has anybody ever talked to him? As he was given the sort of bastinado treatment by the Gestapo. He got out in Posen, like Grisman, David Schofield.
What about the actual liberation of the camp? Do you remember much about that?
Yeah, I remember a lot. I remember this is one of the highlights of my life, as you can imagine. I told you I looked after 5 people, and I mean, we knew that the Americans were about, obviously, from the radio and everything else. And I was early in the morning of whatever it was, sometime in April '45, I was making something, as was my wont, for lunch or something for the chaps I looked after. And having a window high up in the castle, I could see the surrounding country. And you know, I knew every bush, every tree, everything. And there were several lumps on the distant horizon that weren't normally there. So I yelled for Checo, who had a telescope, which you may have heard about, which he'd made, and asked him to look, and he said that's a tank turret. So that was fine. The Union Jack was put out on the roof just as well, because later we heard that that in fact was the forward observation officer for a mobile gunner set up, and they were going to blast hell out of the place. And then when they saw the Union Jack, they realised it was okay. So that was interesting. The next thing that happened was, I suppose, not that day, but the next day, 2 soldiers walked in at the front gate. And that was a good moment. I can't remember what my reaction was after that, but you know, it was sort of free for all, and you know, anybody can go down the town who wants to. So I remember just going for a walk with a chum, and I can't remember who it was, but it was so nice to be able to go out through the gate and just walk. Anyway, then, I don't know, we were making arrangements, and then suddenly there was some sort of a counterattack envisaged, so they whipped us out quick, and I just remember being stuffed into a lorry and driven to an airfield somewhere where, much to our surprise, we were sitting along the runway, and in came Dakota after Dakota after Dakota, nose to tail. We'd never seen before, and didn't know that anybody could land nose to tail. So we were piled into those and driven back to England. It's a great moment, as you can imagine.
Saying about when you did the cooking,
Yeah.
what did you cook on? Was it those big old
It was like the old kitchen range, heated with brown coal, you know, the oblong jobs. It had 2 plates on the top and an oven. And the chaps used to prepare their dishes, whatever they may have been, in a tin plate, if it was a sort of pie thing or something. And we just used to, you know, spend 3 hours, I think it was, of a night, putting things in and taking them out and screaming for people to come and get them when they were ready, sort of thing.
You all shared the same one, did you?
Yes, there was one of these ranges per floor. In fact, I'm not sure, it wasn't one for 2 floors, but the one I worked on was in the main block on the 2nd floor. And I think we did, I don't know, I simply can't remember now. Anyway, it was quite hard work, as you can imagine. I mean, there would be anything up to sort of 50 or 60 different things to cook.
Really?
Yeah, mostly in the oven, but some of it on the top. And there were 3 of us who used to do it. It's all good fun, you know.
And you did that for how many?
Well, I suppose about 100 odd people, roughly.
And was that apart from the German? Because there was a German kitchen.
Oh, there was a German kitchen, and all that produced was a cup of coffee in the morning, and a cup of coffee at about 4 o'clock, or a bloody great cauldron full of coffee, and then a soup sort of morning and evening.
And so
With-
most
with-
of your ingredients were what, Red Cross parcels?
Red Cross parcels, or what we'd saved or got from the soup, or what we got on the black market.
Oh, I see. And how efficient was the black market?
Well, it depended on what you had to offer. I mean, if you had some surplus coffee or chocolate or whatever, or cigarettes, and you gave them to Checo and his organisation, and you would get back. I mean, if you could order, as far as I remember. I don't quite remember how it worked, but I seem to remember if you said you wanted half a dozen eggs, and you produced whatever it was, 50 cigarettes or something for that, or a tin of coffee or something. That's how it worked.
It was as organised as that, was
Oh
it?
yes,
I mean,
yeah.
because it was, I think eventually it was all done through Checo. wasn't
Well, it was all done through Checo, actually, yes. He was the sort of coordinator of it, and he had all his tame goons who produced the stuff. Douglas Bader produced a certain amount when he went out for a walk and brought it back in his legs. But that was mostly for the Sale House and the more senior people. But I can't remember how it worked, to be honest. But I'm pretty sure that it was all done through Checo, which was, of course, a sensible way to do it, really. Although I do believe that now and again, I mean, Lance Pope, you see, who was so fluent speaking-wise, had the odd tame sentry, I'm sure, who did the odd. I mean, I had so many cigarettes, I didn't know what to do with them. I used to get 1,000 a month from Canada. And didn't smoke all that much. I smoked a bit, yes, but not all that much. And
They were more valuable as currency.
oh, far more valuable as currency, yeah.
I know you didn't have very great deal to do with the commandants, but
No.
people like Eggers and
Well, I mean, Eggers and Pupka, I didn't have a lot to do with. I had much more to do with the NCOs, because the tools for the theatre had to be handed in and collected. And that was another way, of course, that I got the odd bit and piece, because if I put 50 cigarettes in the toolbox with a little note, when I drew it back again, it had half a dozen eggs in it or whatever, or some butter or something. So, one was on one's parole bit to not to misuse the tools, and so one didn't. Being a Brit, one didn't. And so I didn't really. I mean, now and again, that head ferret, whose name I forget,
Shedley.
yeah, he used to come up and inspect under the stage in the theatre to make sure that we weren't digging another tunnel or tearing up the ceilings and that sort of thing. But mostly with those chaps, and they're very good, very nice.
Did you get on all right with the Germans you came across? I mean,
Oh yes. But by that stage I spoke fluent German, because having the grammar as background, and one picked it up anyway, and I was quite fluent by the end of the war, which I found very useful when I was serving in Germany after the war.
What did you think of Eggers?
I thought he was. Pupka I admired much more, because he was very correct and didn't fool about. But Eggers I always thought was as I say, slimy, really. Sort of chap who would try and oil his way into your comradeship and then work at it, in the wrong sort of way somehow. But I never really had anything much to do with them, with the officers.
Well, I think that's about all the questions I've got, Hugo. Thanks ever so much.
All right, I'm delighted.
It's
I'm sorry, it's probably been very boring for you.
not at all. Everybody says that, but it never is. It's absolutely incredible. You hear the same stories over and over again.
Yeah.